we're going to go ahead and officially get started. Thanks, Tim. Tim Jacobson is here, and so you'll see some chats from him. He's helping behind the scenes with all the tech and everything. We'd love for you to put in the chat where you're from and just bring a greeting, what organization you're with or church. And if you want to leave your email address, that would just help us to connect later. Sometimes God has done some incredible things in our breakout sessions and really connected ministries together. And so we welcome you to make those connections. So feel free to put your contact information in the chat box and any questions that come up as we go on together today. My name is Dave Jacob, and I'm the founder and director of the Center for Missionary Mobilization and Retention, which is housed here at Trinity Bible College and Graduate School in Ellendale, North Dakota. And it's in partnership with Assemblies of God World Missions that we've formed this initiative that we call the Center. And so basically, though, we just want to be able to resource the mobilization field. We know that there are few resources for mobilizers and missions pastors and others that want to mobilize. And so we just want to fill that gap a little bit and play a small role in helping to provide resources. So we've got a recommended books page. We've got a couple pages of curated articles on various topics related to mobilization. And so please visit our website, missionarymobilization.org, to access those. They're free resources. We're just happy to provide these for you. And we're thankful to our donors who allow that to happen. And so a couple resources I want to point out that are specific to our topic today. We've recorded a couple different podcast episodes, one on mobilizing people of color with Sophia Wong from Send International. And so Tim is going to paste the link to that podcast if you're interested in exploring this topic further after our meeting today. And by the way, this is a Zoom meeting. It is being recorded, and we have muted your microphones to preserve sound quality. So if you could please mute your microphones if it's not already, that would really help us out. So we've got a lot of resources on our website, including this Mobilizing People of Color. We also recorded an episode with a missionary, African-American missionary, to a country in Africa. And so that is also there as a resource, a podcast episode, Mobilizing African Americans, with Marilyn Owusu-Security. And so you can listen to that as well if you'd like to explore this topic. And then in addition, we've just published the second issue of the Missionary Mobilization Journal, which is free in digital format. The topic is the role of diversity in missions mobilization. And so we've got a very diverse group of authors that have spoken in to this topic. And we encourage you to go to this, what Tim has just pasted in, missionarymobilization.org/journal. It's free online. We are in the process of creating a print edition for those that would like to purchase a print copy of it. And so that will be coming soon. But just some incredible authors here that have done a great job in helping us to educate us on mobilizing a diverse missions force. So we encourage you to access that as well. So today, though, we'll get into this. How this will work is for the first 20 minutes, 25 minutes, for the next 25 minutes or so, we're going to be hearing from Brittany Woods of SIM, and I'll introduce her in a minute, but she's going to present on this topic. And then we're going to go into breakout sessions. These are randomly generated. And so we pray that God connects you with others who want to learn more about this topic. It's a time where we can learn from one another and pray together maybe you've got, some ideas for others that have worked, or maybe you've got an area that you're specifically struggling with, that we can connect with one another and really apply what we're learning from Brittany here today in our own local context. So we're going to go to breakout sessions, and then we'll come back for just a couple minutes of wrap up today, and we'll have a Q&A time with Brittany. And so if you've got questions, feel free to paste those in the chat or just jot them down, and we can talk about that at the end of our time together. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Brittany Woods is a North Carolina native who recently moved to Washington, D.C. And in her role as an educator and mobilizer with SIM USA, Brittany has spent the past several years engaging and equipping African-American believers for God's global gospel work. After living in South America for a season and then leading short-term teams all over the world to see how God is moving, Brittany is excited to now focus on mobilizing the next generation as she serves alongside her husband, Alex, who's a campus ministry director at Howard University. So Brittany, it's a joy to have you today. Thank you so much for being with us and volunteering your time to speak into this topic on diverse mobilization. And we'll now turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Dave. Thank you for that introduction, and for you and your team and all that you're doing, and for the invitation to come today. And I just want to thank each one of you who are tuning in. So thanks for taking time out of your schedule to join us. And I do want to take a quick moment to kind of set the tone and frame our time together, because we can't begin to do this topic justice with the short amount of time that we have today. So I want you to lower your expectations. But I also want you to think through the content in ways that are going to spur you towards reflection for your own context. This is not going to be me presenting formulas for your next steps for your organizations or your churches, because each one is individual and is different and unique. And so the reason that we're having this conversation today is because we want to see all of God's people participating in God's work. And while there have been significant gains made over the past decades, there are a lot of gaps that are remaining. So as Dave mentioned, you may be joining us because you've already been asking these questions. Why is having a diverse missions field vital to the Great Commission? Or how can mission agencies and pastors ensure diverse mobilization when our congregations don't necessarily reflect diversity? So you may have seen that email come through and then you jumped on it. Or you may have read the most recent resource, the journal that came out just last week. But even if those aren't the questions that struck you, as Dave mentioned, we would love to know what some of your concerns and questions are. So please utilize that chat box during this time so that we can talk through some of these issues. So I absolutely love this quote. It says, "The way we choose to see the world creates the world we see." A lot of times we can be so focused on what we see because we are unaware of the blind spots that we have, or we only have one perspective. So we create this world that isn't actually the complete picture of reality. So you may be thinking that because you're in a space which has a few elements of diversity, that space could be considered multicultural or even intercultural, but that's not always how everyone is experiencing that same space. So I want to ask this question. What do you want to see in your churches and organizations in terms of diversity? What is your goal? If that's too difficult, too broad of a question to think about, why don't you think about the complete opposite of that question? So what would it take for your organization to stay the way that it is? What would it take for there to be no growth in diversity, for the culture to remain the same for years to come? Would it be the worship style, partnerships with other churches, training of outgoing missionaries, the funding model, member care? What would it take for your organization to stay the same? So if your goal is to not only celebrate diversity, but to intentionally create space for it to exist within your organization, you want to first dig deeper into why you aren't currently diverse or what is preventing the organization or church from being so. So the organization that I am a part of, SIM, believes so much that we are strengthened by diversity that is actually one of our core values. And so this core value reads, we are intentionally international, multi-ethnic, and interdenominational because we believe this best expresses the unity of the body of Christ in the world. We believe we will be more effective in ministry as we incorporate the richness of cultural diversity in SIM and celebrate our oneness in Christ. So that's a beautiful core value. But in reality, what does this look like in practice? What is the actual outworking of this? So you'll see here my team from when I was living and serving in Lima, Peru. And you may be able to identify me there at the bottom left, right above the children. And you may look at this picture and say, wow, look at all that diversity. We had teammates from Canada, US, Peru, Korea, Australia, Switzerland. And not just from the nations that were represented, but there were actually cultures within cultures. So we had Swiss German teammates and French Canadian teammates and Chinese Australian, Indian Australian, African American. And these different elements of our identities added a richness to the ways that we experience life in Peru and that we experience Jesus together. But another thing that I want to highlight in this conversation is that diversity is not just about race. So there are many elements of diversity that we want our teams to embody. And all of these work together. All of these things God uses. These differences complement our team, and they give us a fuller picture of God's family as we work together to accomplish his goals. And this can be diversity of race, ethnicity, gender, socioeconomic status, age, physical abilities, religious beliefs, and in our case, that would be denominational differences, political beliefs, education levels, so forth and so on. And so what's interesting is that as we think about all of these factors of diversity, we look at what shapes each one of us. Because diversity is what we often see externally, but it's based on what's impacted us internally. So our faith background, our upbringing, our physical environment, demographic, cultural factors, ideational factors, so forth and so on, all of that is intertwined into who you are as God created you. Okay. As you look at that list, I actually want you to screenshot or either take a picture to come back to these questions. Because who you are, separate from your organization or the churches you are representing, how you are made up and your identity impacts how you see others. Identity formation involves the way we see ourselves and the way that we are seen by others and the way that we see others. So as you think about your own nationality, your role within your family, physical attributes, first or preferred language, hobbies or passions you may have, gifts or talents that the Lord has placed in you, something that has defined you. Think about how you are and who you present to be. And then think about this. Consider how you view others and if it's from or with that same lens. So do you see your teammates or potential teammates as just their nationality? Or do you recognize the role that they are playing in their family, their hobbies and interests, their skills, the passions, the desires that they have, all of the things that make up their identity? When we want to talk about diversity, it is not simply what we see at face value. Okay? And so how we see others impacts how we act. The third question here on this slide is really important because how are we going to love and serve one another well if we don't see each other in our fullness? Let's look at it another way. So what do you see when you look at this slide? You may see pictures of a bunch of African American believers. You may even be able to identify and recognize some of these brothers and sisters as missionaries. You may even recognize some of these faithful servants as the first missionaries sent from the US to serve in particular ways. So George Lyle at the top left, Betsy Stockton on the second row, first single woman. You see Lot Carey, you see Dr. Andrew Foster, the first missionary specifically to go to deaf Africans. What I want you to notice is that I did not say the first African American missionary. I said the first missionary. So I want to go back to the questions from before. How do we see others and how do we act? Do you see these people as faithful servants to celebrate for their contributions to missions? Or do you see them as part of your own Christian heritage and missionary legacy as you stand on their shoulders in the present day? So as we begin to see ourselves in the light of community that is not just multicultural, but truly intercultural, we move from seeking to diversify organizations to actually creating spaces of belonging. So a lot of times we talk about diversity, we talk about inclusion, which is the practice of diversity in action, or equity, which is everyone having what they need to be successful. But there aren't as many conversations about belonging right now. As you see in the middle of the Venn diagram here, an organization that engages the full potential of the individual creates a place where innovation thrives and views, beliefs, and values are integrated. So how do we get to belonging? We get to belonging by creating a space for the sharing of experiences, by listening, by asking questions and genuinely listening, not just for an answer, but to get to know another person. That's how we move from isolated individuals with different backgrounds to communities which see, value, and honor one another. In our organizations, we really need to caution against the need to make people become like in order to become a part of. Okay, so the early church had the same issues because some disciples did not understand that people did not have to become Jewish in order to follow Jesus. May we not be creating the same stumbling blocks today. I want to read this quote by a Sri Lankan theologian. And it's 2 slides here. So, post-colonialism asks, who has the voice? Who says that these are the rules? Who makes the law? And if you're not part of making laws and rules and the theories, what part do you play? What reality does this disciplinary field or this government or this system try to crush? What reality is it trying to erase? What reality is it trying to suppress? Applying this to biblical studies, post-colonial biblical criticism poses the following questions. Who has the power to interpret or tell stories? To whom do the stories or texts belong? Who controls their meaning? Who decides which texts we choose? Against whom are these stories or interpretations aimed? What is their ethical effect? Who has the power to access data? So when thinking about this in the context of moving from biblical studies to missionary mobilization, I want to ask a couple more questions. Are we trusting the voices of those with different backgrounds, but the same Holy Spirit? Are we truly listening to the experiences a Black missionary or an Asian missionary may have on a team, which varies from a white missionary on that team, without placing bias or judgment on what they are sharing? I can tell you, I have had many experiences serving overseas, which have varied from my colleagues, and not necessarily all negative, just different. But it was only in the tenderness from some teammates who provided a safe space for me to communicate that made me feel like I belonged rather than being dismissed. So I'll give a couple small examples. I took a short-term team to West Africa a few years ago, and we were in the capital city of the country that we were visiting. So traffic was insane all of the time. I mean, motorized traffic, foot traffic, animal traffic, you name it. Our short-term team had gotten pretty adept at being able to dodge cars and would find that sweet spot in the lull to dash across the street. So about the third or fourth day, we were walking with one of the long-term missionaries in that country who was white. And she joined us to go to church. So we came to this really busy road that we had crossed many times already. And I kid you not, we were absolutely amazed when traffic completely stopped to let us cross. It was only once we were on the other side that we realized it was because of the presence of the white missionary who was with us. This is not an example of race or any kind of discrimination practices or anything like that. This is simply to prove that our experiences are different when we are serving on teams. Another example that I have is from my time living in Peru. Often because of my skin color, people would not assume that I was from the US. They would assume I was either Colombian or from a region in Peru called Chincha, which actually had a lot of African descendants. And so we would take public transportation pretty often, and I would get on the bus with my white teammates and I would just be charged less, simply because the assumption was that I was not with them and I was not wealthy. Again, these are pretty harmless examples for this conversation, but I want to highlight that as organizations, we have to make space to listen to all of the stories and experiences of workers from different backgrounds as we're seeking to mobilize. It's not just the traumatic stories of direct racism that need to capture our attention. Okay? A space of belonging means that each experience is valid and valued, and learning about one another creates community as it shapes how we live and serve with one another. So, in thinking about that, I pose these two questions. How are you set up to send? And how are you set up to receive people from different backgrounds? So we have the great privilege of not just reaching the lost overseas, but as mobilizers, reaching the found in order to send them. So how are you set up to do that? To receive people into your organization in order to send them out? Does your organization hold times of worship? And if so, what are they like? What are meal times like? Who leads cross-cultural equipping and training sessions, and how is that done? A lot of times, people from minority contexts, and again, not just ethnically minority, but it could be life stage. It could be the person who is the minority in discipline. Maybe there's a room full of church planters and there's one person who's not a church planter. But a lot of times people are adept at navigating those uncomfortable situations. The point here is that if we want to actually create welcoming environments, what are we going to do to remove those barriers and make those adaptations unnecessary? One of the biggest considerations as you are seeking to mobilize a diverse missions force is, what does your member care look like? And not simply just representation, but going back to the listening of the experiences of the missionaries. That is one of the key and most integral ways to care well for our missionaries. We want to create safe environments for people to be fully themselves and to serve authentically. And so what I also want to highlight here is that this can't just be your organization or your church, but what does your personal life look like? Who is in your circle of friends? Who is in your circle of influence? Which pastors who are not from your background or who do not think like you are you listening to and genuinely seeking to learn from? Representation does matter. So can people who are not in the majority culture, again, whether ethnically, marital status, life stage, whatever, can they see themselves thriving and healthy in your organization? So we've already discussed the environment, but what about your promotional materials? Who does your website show? Who is in your videos? Who is in your brochures? I remember meeting a student at a cross conference a couple of years ago, and she actually approached our booth simply because we were the only organization that had this very picture printed on our brochure. And she said, "I can see myself in your printed materials." And we were able to start a conversation. What is your support structure like? Are there opportunities for discussion about different funding models, or is it just we've always done it this way, so others must fit into the box? I know that in this day, this is very important with our missional business and professionals as business models that are also going, or professionals as mission, sorry, models that are going on, ways for people to get into countries that they can't take a missionary visa. So is there an understanding of fiscal resources and spending from different sending contexts? And then lastly, I've already mentioned the member care piece, which is so integral. Are you thinking about how you can care well for people you are inviting into your organization as they process their experiences, or waiting until a conflict happens? If this isn't even possible within your organization, maybe because of the size or the location. I know some of you have geographical considerations, right? Can you partner with other organizations or churches and share people resources? The World Christian Database estimates that there are around 430,000 global missionaries serving around the world, which many of you probably already know. Somewhere around 120,000 being sent from the US right now. There's less than 300 of these cross-cultural gospel workers estimated who are African American. And I'm going to argue that that is very much on the high end of this. And this isn't because African American believers don't believe in the Great Commission. And it's not because there aren't simply enough African Americans who believe in the US. Out of 47 million Black Americans in the US, 8 out of 10 identify as Christian. Yet less than half of 1% are global missionaries. So I'm speaking from the African American context because that's my familiarity, but that's certainly not the only consideration. Consider first or second generation immigrants who may want to serve, but who have concerns with their visas or other documentation. There are a host of reasons and factors that contribute to barriers that are preventing workers of the gospel from going out. I believe I saw my brother Richard on here earlier, and I hope that he doesn't mind me highlighting him, but he and his family went out to serve several years ago. And that year that they left, they were the only, by estimation, the only African-American family that went to serve long-term that year. This is a real issue. And it's not just because of a lack of desire, which we may think. So you may have heard the proverb, give a man a fish and he'll eat for a day, teach a man to fish and he'll eat for a lifetime. But I want to offer this perspective. It doesn't actually matter if you teach a man or a woman to fish and you give this person all of the tools to do so, if you then send them to a location where there are no fishing signs posted everywhere. So is your organization somewhere where there are no fishing signs posted? Have you given tools, but failed to see the gaps between the people that you are trying to equip and the way that they can actually use those tools to get to where they need to go? As you consider and continue to consider these facets of multicultural teams, because again, this isn't just about how do we get people in the door, it's about how do they thrive once they land in their country of service. Continue to consider these life issues that will be affected. Multicultural teams mean multiple views and multiple ways of doing life, right? And so life issues that will be affected are ideas on children's education, expectations about team fellowship and ministry, communication styles, navigating change, roles of husbands and wives in ministry, lifestyle expectations, attitudes towards extended family, leadership styles in churches. All of these issues come into play on your teams. They're already difficult enough, I would imagine you already know, to work with monocultural teams, right? So we do need to be thinking about these things. It's not just to recruit, it is to equip to thrive. So in order to do that, here's a couple of dynamics of difference that would be important to understand and to think through, recognizing the power and influence of culture. I gave the example earlier about our team in West Africa crossing the street. There's some power and influence dynamics affecting that. Understand how each of our backgrounds affects our responses to others. So not just how our background allows us to enter into a space, but how it affects our responses. A really key and significant point is to not assume that all members of a cultural group share the same beliefs and practices. Again, you can just look at your own family and think about maybe a family dinner and all of the various opinions, all of the various viewpoints that are represented in that space. And y'all are having the exact same experience coming from the same background, okay? Build on the strengths and the resources of each culture in an organization. This is another really key point. I think one of the biggest gifts that we are missing out in not identifying differences is that we're not identifying strengths. It is a really good thing that everyone is not the same, because that would mean we would all have the same weaknesses, right? But we have differences, and those differences can be strengths, and they can add value to complement a team as a unit. And so I want to bring this to a close because I think the most important thing for us to consider is the biblical why. So I can give a lot of theoretical answers and I can give a lot of cultural answers, but the main question that we are asking is why? So here we are in Acts, and we know that at Pentecost, there were Jews from every nation under heaven represented. And so we pick up in chapter 2, verse 7, which says that they were astounded and amazed, saying, "Look, aren't all these who are speaking Galileans? How is it that each of us can hear them in our own native language? Parthians, Medes, Elamites, those who live in Mesopotamia, in Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt and the parts of Libya near Cyrene. Visitors from Rome, both Jews and converts, Cretans and Arabs. We hear them declaring the magnificent acts of God in our own tongues." So we look at this and we look at all of the languages and cultures represented. And here we see multicultural worship is not new. We are not doing a new thing by trying to diversify our organizations. This is diversity. But I want to highlight a little shift that happens a few years later in Antioch. So the disciples had been scattered because of persecution, and some are only sharing with Jews, but others are proclaiming Christ to the Greeks. And we pick up right now where Barnabas has gone to Tarsus to search for Saul, and he brings him to Antioch. And it's here that we see, picking up in verse 26, for a whole year they met with the church and they taught large numbers. And the disciples were first called Christians at Antioch. Why is this? You've got this walled city filled with Romans and Syrians and Jews and Greeks, and they all live in their walled off sections, but they step outside of these quarters to meet with one another as a faith community. Up until now, people were only identified by their tribes, right? But now the rest of the city who is observing this community has no way to refer to this mixed and multi-ethnic group of people. So they have to come up with a new name. They were from different tribes, but they were all together, fully themselves, authentically worshiping God in unity. This is belonging. This is what moves from diversity to belonging. They were all one people, Christians. What is grievous is that 2,000 years later, people, at least in our context, are not looking at diverse groups made of different ages and ethnicities and skills and recognizing such groups as Christians bonded together. So what would it look like for the communities where our teams are serving to have only one way that makes sense to identify those teams? And that would be to name them as Christians. Because they see the unity, because they see God's glory demonstrated and celebrated in the diversity. And because of that, they are compelled to join his kingdom. To get there, you cannot just say that you want to be diverse and expect it to happen. What type of diversity do you want to create space for? And how do you move towards that? And how much are you willing to do for the partnership that you desire? How much of a priority is this really? Is it a webinar once a month that you come to gain information? Or is it building relationships across different ethnic, age, discipline lines to help people see where they fit in God's story? Not even just where they fit in your organization, but where they fit in God's story. So I'm going to show a few slides as Dave comes back on and gives you instructions for your breakout groups. If you will just take pictures or screenshots of those slides, there's some action steps. I know I said I wasn't going to give them, but I do have some action steps for you to consider, just so you can figure out what it is that God's inviting you to. You may not need to do every single one. You may not even be able to. But what is one step that you can take this week for your organization or your church? So I'll just kind of slide through, and Dave, you can give instruction.
Thank you, Brittany. Such an amazing presentation. Very, very challenging and informative. And we call this the Porch because it's a place for you to hang out with other mobilizers and to chat and to pray together and to encourage one another. And so as we get ready to go into breakout sessions, we encourage you to discuss these issues, these action steps, some of the questions that Brittany posed. And so we're going to create these breakout sessions now. And so about 20 minutes, and then we're going to come back at the top of the hour and wrap things up. And if you need to go then, that's okay. But we are going to stay on for a few minutes afterwards to ask questions with Brittany. So if you've got extra time, we only planned an hour today, but we will stay on here past that. So we're going to go into breakout sessions for 20 minutes. Please be involved in these. Please pray together, encourage one another. And so thank you also, Richard, for being on here. Richard Coleman is one of our authors in the journal that just came out and is an expert in this area as well. So just great to have such a diverse group of people from all over the world here learning and studying about this. So Tim, if you could go ahead and create those breakout rooms, you're going to see something pop up on your screen now, and please just go ahead and click to join one of those breakout rooms, and we will see you in about 20 minutes. Did you all have some, as we're waiting for people to come back on here, did you have some good discussion in your groups and prayer time together or anything?
Yeah, we did, Dave. We forgot to pray. But I want to share this one comment that I was sharing with my group that just dawned on me. And Brittany, maybe you can attest to this. Great presentation, by the way. So Jim Sutherland and I and another person are working on the current stats of just African Americans in missions. And right now there's probably less than 200. I'll let Jim give you the exact numbers. But what's interesting is when you look at me, I'm thoroughly African American, lived in a 99.9% Black environment till I was finished my first year of college. But I've always been a person who's been considered on the fringes. I've always been open to diversity, always been the guy who was labeled as white boy, whatever. So when you look at the African Americans who are actually serving with agencies, I wonder how many would be considered those of us who are already open to diverse experiences. Also, a large number are in interracial relationships. So we have like Donald Page in my organization, his wife is white, or you go through the list. So the word I'm going to use is, I guess, a people is it called a people movement or a people movement toward Christ or something like that?
Mhm.
I don't see that kind of thing happening. I see people with ethnicity, as the category, but I don't see a movement happening within the larger group that's mobilizing those that identify strongly and are a lot less open to the foreign or the diverse as someone like me or even Brittany. I don't know what her experience has been, maybe labeled as white girl or, whatever. But in organizations, these are the people that are typically attracted. How do we reach the people that are less likely to be exposed to you guys? So just a few thoughts.
Mhm.
May I respond, Dave?
Please, yes.
Thank you so much for highlighting that, Richard. That is huge. And that is, I think it goes into so many different layers. And I think on one of the slides I'd highlighted, don't expect or assume that people all from one culture share the same experiences. And this is exactly what Richard is talking about. We are, we can be considered a part of an ethnicity or a culture, but that doesn't mean that we have the same perspectives as everyone else that we share this culture with. And I think the question that Richard asked at the end is, how do we actually get people who wouldn't necessarily be typically have a propensity towards a new experience to consider it? And it goes back to even how we came into missions and representation. So is your organization, and I'm going to say a really bold statement here because we're having a conversation among family members, right? Is your organization set up to receive someone who doesn't sound like me, doesn't present like I do, wears braids in her hair? I mean, until very recently, I didn't even wear my hair natural. I would straighten my hair. So does someone feel comfortable coming as their full selves in your organization and not just coming in to be invited, but is their voice valued? Is their perspective, is their experience highlighted and honored? Or are they kind of checked at the door because they're different, right? I think that that's huge, and that's going to have huge implications for how we mobilize, how we recruit, how we even invite people in. Because if they already know, nope, I'm not going to be accepted, they're not going to try. Because again, we're talking about removing barriers. So for Richard and I, as he posed this question, part of the barrier was already removed because we had an interest in different cultures. For someone who doesn't have that interest, how do we help them find their fit in God's story? One key thing that I can highlight in this conversation is DC. So I'm in Southeast DC, Ward 8, largely Black, I mean, like 98% Black district. And we are about to have the first perspectives class ever in DC. So there's always been perspectives classes in Maryland or Virginia, but there's never been a perspectives class in DC proper. So what is that going to look like? Who's going to come into those classes? It's going to look very different from the classes that Perspectives has had in this region before. Are we looking at the folks who are going to be coming in those classes as potential future missionaries? Or are we just going to celebrate the fact that we now have the first class in DC? So it's things like that, yeah, absolutely, we need to consider and need to not be afraid of having these conversations. So thank you so much, Richard, for bringing that up.
Yes, really good. And we are pushing our time here. So if you need to go, we certainly want to respect that. But this has been so rich that we've decided to continue this discussion. And so we've lost a few, but there's 25 of us or so on right now. And if you've got questions for Brittany or for Richard or anyone else, we just, for the next several minutes, would like to just offer that, to stay on here and continue this discussion, because these are vital issues for the kingdom. And so anyone have a question that you would like to ask, please feel free to unmute and go ahead and ask it. Brittany or anyone really, maybe you've got some ideas on how do we help those that are in authority above us to see the importance of this issue.
So one of the things that I was sharing with Dave as we were discussing this earlier is this first statement that I'm going to make is unfortunately not really something that you can affect, but it is something that you can observe. So how hard you have to fight your leadership in some of these conversations is going to show whether or not diversity is going to be viewed as a trend or viewed as a value. So if you're having to fight your leadership for different marketing, for different materials, all of these things, my guess is that diversity is going to be viewed as more of a trend, right? And not of a value. We are talking about counting the cost, and not just a financial cost, but what is it that we are trying to do? We are trying to mobilize, again, all God's people to participate in his work. And so we really should stop at nothing, because we should be excited that this is a possibility and a privilege that we even get to do this, that we live in a day and a time that we get to participate in his work in this way. And so the second thing that I had told Dave is that sometimes we may have to lead by leading, or lead our leaders. That's what I said, lead our leaders. And so if you're not in a position where you can make decisions, you're not in a position of authority within your organization, how do you share stories that you have already heard from either African-American, Asian-American, Latino missionaries or missionary candidates about how they feel coming into your organization or barriers that they have experienced? Who can you ask to join you at a booth or a table at an event? If your organization is all white, and I'll use Dave because you gave the example, he's also in North Dakota. And so it's like, if you're in a space where there is simply geographically just not a lot of diversity, who can you invite to stand with you at your table? If you can't change your marketing materials, if you can't change your website, can you get an interview? We live in this age of technology. Can you have someone on an iPad and have the video on loop at a conference so people still see that representation? What are the other ways that you can at least show and start trying to embody diversity, even if you aren't there yet? Again, what music are you listening to if you have chapel times? Is it all just like a variation or different variations of the same song or the same hymns? Are you actually listening to even music in different languages as mission organizations, right? I think one of the key gaps, unfortunately, that we experience mobilizing from the US is that a lot of times we forget what it's like to actually be intercultural. So we talked about intentionality as well, right? We are super intentional once we get in Peru and I'm trying to meet my neighbors and I want to know, the lady at the market and all of this thing. You're super intentional. You're on fire for God because you want to make friendships for evangelism's sake, right? Well, are we that intentional here as we're trying to mobilize? Are we that intentional in listening to people's experiences and their input as well? Do we value input, or are we just asking for it and then we're going to dismiss it? Because if we're asking diverse groups of people for their input, it is likely going to be different from ours. So does that mean we simply disagree with it? Or do we take in that input and see, how can we apply this, Lord? What are you asking me to glean from this? Yeah, I would love to hear someone else's thoughts.
Brittany, can I say something from a totally different angle?
Please.
Let me try to step in the shoes of a white person. I've spent lots of time in majority white environments. So here's the reality. Here's the elephant in the room. If you walk up to your leader and you start talking diversity, that leader is possibly going to hear, you're asking me to believe in critical race theory. You're leading me toward a liberal path. America is going to become communist and socialist, and we're going to lose all of our donors, and the whole country is going to go to hell because we opened the door, we gave a little crack, and now we just opened this floodgate. And so I'm an Enneagram 6, so I understand. If you don't like Enneagram, that's totally okay, but for me, it's been helpful. So fear is my vice. If you tell me any scenario, any situation, I'll think out to the nth degree immediately all the things that could go wrong with my relationships, with my safety, with my mind, everything. And then I will rebut that thing just out of fear. And there are a lot of agency leaders who are trying to protect a lot of things: image, legacy, donors, the country, all these values, ideals. And so if you come into the office and use buzzwords like, I really think that we ought to, whatever, if you use that buzzword, it's going to be like a tender wound. You just touch it and the person's going to react out of fear. And so I would say, just be careful of the language that you use. Try to communicate that. Have you ever played that game called Taboo? The goal is to get somebody to say the word at the top without saying any of the words that are the common words that are associated with this thing. Learn how to communicate the exact same message without saying the buzzwords, without saying the elephant in the room or the issue that's going to get you, out of the room in the conversation. And as you do that, you can gradually introduce that person to the concepts and the ideas, with that. And I found that to be helpful myself. Because if I come in and say, oh, white privilege and white tears and, critical race theory, yada, yada, I won't even have a conversation. I'll immediately be shown the door.
Great insights. Thank you so much, both of you. We have a question from, I believe, Jai Choi, if I'm pronouncing your name correctly. He asks, are there established partnerships of organizations working to grow together in areas of diversity?
If I can put you on the spot, I'm so sorry, but Mark, would you like to jump in? Mark Stebbins?
Yeah, no, I'm glad you put me on the spot. Yeah, I think that Missio Nexus, for example, would be what came to my mind is that there is a growing movement and God's doing it. And I think, out of the pain of George Floyd and all the history and all the reality checking that's been happening, there's just such a vacuum in this whole area. So Brittany, thanks for your presentation today. I just so much appreciate the gifts God's given you to communicate and from the heart. But I think that I would encourage anybody that hasn't checked out Missio Nexus, if you're a member, that would be ideal. Then you could take advantage of some of the presentations, some of the offerings that are being made in this area of diversity and inclusion and growing into genuine and authentic diversity that we need so desperately. And I feel like out of that, some other spin-off initiatives have been happening, and that's just something God's doing, like partnership with NAMAC. That has been a beautiful thing to witness God at work doing with Missio Nexus people, NAMAC people. There's just a growing movement, kind of a critical mass taking shape.
Yes. Thank you, Mark. And if you're not familiar with Missio Nexus or NAMAC, I think Tim is putting the NAMAC link into the chat. Missio Nexus is there. Highly encourage you to become a member of Missio Nexus. It puts you into a network of others who are learning right alongside of you, gives you resources. We here at the Center for Missionary Mobilization and Retention are members, and in fact, I just signed up for the leadership conference that's in Dallas in September, which it gives you so many connections of networking and partnerships, and the learning that take place is just remarkable. So also NAMAC is there. If you're not familiar with them, we encourage you to be involved and to partner with the National African American Missions Council and all the incredible work that they are doing to mobilize African Americans around the world. So let's continue to open it up as long as people, I know some of you got to go to a different meeting, that's fine if you need to go. But this is such a rich topic and an important issue. And so are there other questions that you would have? Feel free to unmute or type those in the chat.
Hi, we're here in Chicago. One of the things that we're just trying to work through. Sorry, hopefully they can hear me. I'm in a coffee shop here. Is just that it feels like often when we engage the minority areas of the city and areas that we have churches, trying to come in with like a global perspective. It feels like that the more the whiter churches have more of a category for global missions. And then in minority communities, that category in regards to just church life doesn't really seem to be there as much, and it feels like their focus is more local, out of the necessity of some of the issues that they're working through, whether it's an immigrant community, an African American community, a Hispanic community. And just wondering if you have any advice or just thoughts on how to go about that. I was with a pastor literally this week, works in an African American neighborhood, and he understood biblically the mandate for global missions, but practically speaking, he just didn't really understand how he was going to get his people to kind of lift up their eyes to where they would be a part of that when it's like a low income neighborhood. So just any thoughts on how even an integration of like different ethnicities and socioeconomic different varying backgrounds, how that relates to this as well. So that's what's going on in my head, just to throw that out there.
Thank you so much, Philip, and thank you for tuning in and like faithfully pressing through in this coffee shop. I have a couple of thoughts, and I'm going to try to keep it short. So if I don't get back to your question, please pop on and remind me what I want to say at the end. But the first thing that I want to highlight is that organizations have to do the work of recognizing the historical implications. So it's not just that present day we see that African American, Hispanic churches, et cetera, aren't as focused about global missions as they are local. It has been a historical barrier that has been placed a lot of times between organizations and missionaries and churches who have wanted to send people over the years, right? I see Richard just made a statement about his blog post there. So definitely, if anyone's not seeing the chat, check out blackblessings.com. But one of the key considerations is that missionary mobilization from the church perspective is a discipleship issue. So it's not simply about helping people figure out how to move out of their own context of need, which is valid, to having this global view, which is also valid. It is about helping people understand the desperate need for everyone to know Jesus. And there are people who are living and dying around the world without knowing that Jesus exists. So we've got to move from thinking about missions and helping churches think about missions as not just a humanitarian thing where you like tag Jesus onto the end of something, but threading global gospel work throughout every element of the church. So is it coming from the Sunday service sermons? Is it coming from the discipleship groups? If you are in a small group Bible study and you're studying, If God is For Us by Trillia Newbell, are you praying for a country at the end of that study? Like, how do you thread missions throughout the context of the church life? And so it's not just this one thing. And honestly, I would argue that for the white church, that needs to be the case as well. It's a discipleship issue. It's not a program.
Yes.
Not an event. It's a discipleship issue. Now, in your context, where you're kind of working with a bunch of different churches and a bunch of different regions within Chicago, I mean, that's going to be just faithful, like hard work, and you just can't give up because it's not going to be quick, and it's not going to be the response that is, I'm going to present an opportunity for people to go on a trip, and they're either going to say yes or no. So it may be you laying the groundwork for several years before you ever even get somebody overseas. But there's a lot more of the historical implications too, about even why churches, especially in the inner city, are focused on local evangelism and local need. And how do we help them see that that is part of God's story, and what else is part of God's story as well?
Really good. And just another resource, the latest issue of the Missionary Mobilization Journal, the lead article is regarding mobilizing the Black church, written by a Black pastor. And so that's free on our website at missionarymobilization.org/journal. So we're getting down there. Is there one more question? And then I think we'll sign off for today. And by the way, we do this about 4 times a year, every quarter. So the next one will be in October here. But would there be one more question to close us out? Anyone? Okay, well, thank you, Brittany. If other questions do arise, you can see Brittany has typed in her email address. And by the way, you can save this chat. It's that box in the bottom right corner of the chat side of the screen. There's 3 dots in there, and you can click on that and hit save chat. And yes, Roland, sounds like this is part 1 and we need another session. Absolutely. Let's keep having these conversations, and let's keep having these discussions with our colleagues, with our friends, with our pastors, and with our leaders, as well as we endeavor to mobilize more missionaries, a diverse missions field that is unified in unity and it just exhibits and represents Jesus well. That is what we're hoping for. So thank you everyone for being involved today and for all the input. Thank you so much, Brittany, for the time that you put in. An incredible presentation that I know I'm going to be chewing on for a long time. So Richard, appreciate your input, and Mark as well, representing Missio Nexus. God bless you, everyone, and we'll see you next time.